The age of deception and extraction. War no longer begins with a declaration. There is no formal announcement, no moment when the world collectively realizes that a new line has been crossed. Instead, modern conflict unfolds in fragments. Through intelligence leaks, cyber disruptions, financial shocks, and operations that officially never happened. Sometimes a man is declared dead when he is very much alive. Sometimes a president disappears before dawn. In early 2026, two events, separated by continents but united by strategy, revealed just how radically the nature of power has changed. In Eastern Europe, Ukrainian intelligence convinced Russia that one of its most wanted enemies had been eliminated. A carefully staged drone strike, a burning vehicle, a believable story. Moscow paid a bounty, $500,000, only to discover it had been deceived. The man was alive. The agents were exposed. The money now funded the very war Russia was trying to win. Thousands of kilometers away in Caracas, the deception was not about death, but about removal. In a single night, elite American forces entered Venezuelan airspace, bypassed Russian-made defenses, and extracted Nicolás Maduro, a sitting head of state, from his fortified residence. By morning, he was gone. By evening, he was facing charges in New York. No invasion, no prolonged battle, no second chance. These were not isolated incidents. They were signals. Signals that the rules governing war, sovereignty, and power projection are being rewritten in real time. This is not the era of mass armies clashing across borders. It is the era of precision humiliation, where intelligence agencies, special forces, and economic leverage achieve what divisions and tanks once could not. Russia believed it could buy a death. The United States proved it could capture a president. And in both cases, the consequences rippled far beyond the individuals involved. For Vladimir Putin, these events struck at the heart of two core pillars of Russian strategy. The first was internal destabilization, the belief that dissidents could be eliminated quietly, decisively, and cheaply. Ukraine shattered that illusion, not by protecting its ally with brute force, but by turning Russian intelligence against itself. The second pillar was global influence. Venezuela was more than a political ally. It was an economic lifeline, an energy reserve, and a strategic counterweight to Western pressure. When Maduro fell, Russia did not just lose a partner, it lost leverage, revenue, and credibility. And perhaps most damaging of all, Russian military technology, air defense systems, tanks, surveillance tools, failed to stop either operation. That failure was not lost on the world. This video is not about heroism or villains, it is about methods. How intelligence services manufacture reality. How modern wars are financed, manipulated, and sustained. How leaders are protected or abandoned by the systems they trust. We will break down how Ukraine staged a death so convincing that Russia paid for it, how the United States removed a foreign president without declaring war. Why Venezuela's oil mattered more than ideology, how Russia's economy absorbed a shock it could not prevent, and how Vladimir Putin is now using the argument of moral equivalence to justify future actions. Because when the powerful bend the rules, they do not break them loudly. They break them quietly and let the consequences speak later. This is the story of deception as a weapon, extraction as strategy, and a world where the most decisive battles are fought before anyone realizes they've begun. Chapter: Operation Delta Force. The night Nicolás Maduro was taken. In the early hours of January 3, 2026, while Caracas was still asleep, a decision made thousands of kilometers away reshaped the balance of power far beyond Venezuela. What followed was not a declaration of war, nor a diplomatic ultimatum, but a silent, highly coordinated military operation carried out with surgical precision. By sunrise, Nicolás Maduro, the longtime president of Venezuela, and his wife Celia Flores were no longer in their fortified residence. They were in American custody. This was Operation Delta Force, one of the most audacious U.S. special operations of the 21st century. A long-prepared target for Washington, Nicolás Maduro had been a target for years. Accused by U.S. authorities of turning Venezuela into a hub for drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and narco-terrorism, Maduro had been under sealed indictment since 2020. But until 2026, those charges remained symbolic, legal documents without enforcement. What changed was the strategic environment. By late 2025, Venezuela had become more than a regional problem. It had evolved into a critical geopolitical node, deeply connected to Russia's war economy. As Western sanctions tightened around Moscow, Caracas emerged as a potential financial lifeline. Trade between Russia and Venezuela surged, military cooperation intensified, and discussions reportedly focused on oil extraction partnerships that could indirectly fund Russia's war effort in Ukraine. From Washington's perspective, this was no longer tolerable. The decision to act. According to U.S. officials, the decision to capture Maduro was not impulsive. It followed months of intelligence gathering, scenario planning, and internal debate. Rather than pursuing regime change through proxy forces or economic pressure, the U.S. opted for a decapitation strategy. Remove the leader, destabilize the alliance network, and reshape the strategic landscape in one move. This was not an invasion, it was an extraction. The battlefield. Without a front line unlike conventional wars, there were no advancing troops, no declared combat zones. The battlefield was electromagnetic, digital, and aerial. In the hours leading up to the operation, cyber units disrupted Venezuelan communications infrastructure. Radar coverage around Caracas degraded. Command and control systems went dark or began transmitting false data. Venezuelan air defenses, many of them Russian-supplied, were effectively blinded before a single American soldier crossed the border. At the same time, U.S. aircraft took positions across the Caribbean. Stealth fighters, electronic warfare platforms, drones, and refueling tankers formed a layered shield in the sky. Their role was not to bomb indiscriminately, but to ensure total air dominance for a very short window. That window would be enough. Dawn in Caracas. Just before dawn, helicopters carrying Delta Force operators crossed into Venezuelan airspace at low altitude. They avoided population centers, followed pre-mapped corridors, and relied on real-time intelligence feeds. Their destination was a heavily fortified residence complex in Caracas, designed to withstand riots, coups, and assassination attempts. Maduro believed it was secure. He believed his air defenses were intact. He believed his allies would warn him. All of that proved wrong. The assault unfolded in minutes. Explosive charges breached outer defenses. Elite operators moved with speed and discipline, neutralizing guards before alarms could be raised. There was no prolonged firefight, no dramatic last stand. The goal was not to kill, it was to capture alive. Maduro and Celia Flores were located, restrained, and extracted before most of the city realized anything had happened. Within hours, they were no longer in Venezuela. The operation was over almost as quickly as it began. From Caracas to New York, Maduro's journey out of Venezuela followed a carefully controlled route, first by helicopter, then by ship, and finally by aircraft. The destination was New York, where U.S. prosecutors were waiting. The charges were severe: narco-terrorism, large-scale cocaine trafficking, weapons violations, and conspiracy to import illegal drugs into the United States. For the first time, these accusations were no longer theoretical. The message from Washington was clear. Political power would no longer shield Maduro from legal accountability. A shockwave through Moscow. The capture of Maduro sent shockwaves far beyond Latin America. For Vladimir Putin, it was a strategic catastrophe. Venezuela had become one of Russia's most important non-Western partners. Trade had surged. Energy cooperation was expanding. Caracas offered Moscow access to massive oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels, the largest proven reserves on Earth. In a world of sanctions and isolation, Venezuela represented leverage, liquidity, and geopolitical depth. That leverage vanished overnight. Without Maduro, Russia lost not just a partner, but a gateway. Oil extraction plans were frozen. Arms cooperation was exposed as ineffective. And perhaps most damaging of all, Russian military technology, air defense systems, tanks, surveillance tools, had failed to prevent a U.S. operation in the heart of a friendly capital. The implication was devastating. Russian weapons could not stop American power. The oil factor energy markets reacted immediately. If Venezuela's oil industry were revived under U.S. oversight or a Western-aligned government, global oil supply would increase significantly. More supply means lower prices. Lower prices mean reduced revenues for energy exporting states, especially Russia, whose war economy depends heavily on oil and gas income. In other words, Maduro's capture was not just a political act, it was an economic strike. The question of sovereignty. The operation triggered fierce debate across the world. Supporters framed it as a law enforcement action against a criminal regime that had destroyed its own country. Critics called it a blatant violation of international law and Venezuelan sovereignty. There was no UN mandate, no formal declaration of hostilities, just force. For many analysts, this raised an uncomfortable question. Where is the line between justice and power? Putin's counter-narrative. In Moscow, the Kremlin quickly began shaping a response. Not militarily, but rhetorically. Russian officials argued that the U.S. had set a precedent. If Washington could extract a foreign leader by force, why should Russia be condemned for intervening in Ukraine or elsewhere within what it calls its sphere of influence? This concept, often referred to as moral equivalence, became a cornerstone of Russian messaging. The argument was simple. Rules apply selectively and power decides legitimacy. Whether the world accepts that logic is another matter. Venezuela. After Maduro, inside Venezuela, the power vacuum was immediate. Without Maduro, institutions fractured. Loyalists attempted to maintain control while rival factions maneuvered for influence. Armed civilian groups filled the streets. The future of the country became uncertain overnight. For ordinary Venezuelans, the operation offered both hope and fear. Hope for change, fear of instability. A new era of warfare. Operation Delta Force will be studied for decades, not because of its scale, but because of what it represents. A world where wars are no longer declared, leaders are captured rather than assassinated, and battles are won through intelligence dominance rather than massed armies. It marked the collapse of one alliance and exposed the vulnerability of another. And above all, it delivered a clear message to Moscow, Beijing, and beyond. In the modern era, power does not announce itself. It arrives before dawn and leaves before anyone can stop it. Chapter: The Economic Shockwave. How Maduro's Fall hit Russia where it hurts most. When Nicolás Maduro was removed from power, the headlines focused on the spectacle. The raid, the arrest, the legal charges. But the real damage did not unfold in courtrooms or on television screens. It unfolded quietly, inside balance sheets, energy markets, and strategic calculations in Moscow. For Russia, Maduro was not just an ideological ally or a diplomatic talking point. He was part of a survival strategy. And with his capture, that strategy began to collapse. Venezuela, Russia's hidden economic lifeline. By 2024 and 2025, Russia's economy was under intense pressure. Sanctions limited access to Western finance, technology, and markets. Traditional energy routes were disrupted. The Kremlin needed alternatives. Partners willing to trade outside Western systems, accept discounted deals, and ignore political costs. Venezuela fit perfectly. Trade between Russia and Venezuela surged dramatically, growing by more than 60% in a single year. On paper, this looked modest compared to Russia's overall trade volume. In reality, it was strategically vital. These were not ordinary exports and imports. They were sanctions-resistant transactions. Russian companies gained access to Venezuelan ports, infrastructure, and energy assets. Venezuelan entities received weapons, spare parts, fuel additives, and financial support. Most importantly, discussions advanced around oil extraction partnerships that could bypass Western scrutiny. This relationship was not about friendship. It was about cash flow. Oil, the center of gravity. At the heart of the alliance was oil. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world. over 300 billion barrels. That is more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Russia itself. But for years, Venezuela lacked the technology, investment, and stability to fully exploit those reserves. Production collapsed, infrastructure decayed, skilled labor fled the country. Russia saw opportunity. Russian state-linked energy firms reportedly explored long-term arrangements, technical assistance, joint ventures, and extraction rights. In return, Moscow would gain access to vast reserves that could be monetized discreetly, blended into global supply chains, or leveraged politically. For a Russia constrained by sanctions, Venezuelan oil was not just energy. It was strategic oxygen. The day the plan died, Maduro's removal froze those ambitions instantly. Contracts became legally uncertain. Infrastructure projects stalled. Russian personnel faced evacuation or isolation. Any hope of quietly expanding Russian influence over Venezuelan energy evaporated. Worse still, the political direction of Venezuela suddenly became unpredictable. If a future government aligned more closely with Washington or Western institutions, Russian access to oil fields, ports, and financial channels would likely be terminated altogether. From Moscow's perspective, this was not a setback. It was a structural loss. Oil prices and the global domino effect. The shock extended beyond bilateral relations. Energy markets are sensitive to expectations, not just supply. The possibility that Venezuela's oil industry could be revived under U.S. supervision or Western-friendly leadership triggered immediate recalculations. If Venezuelan production were restored even partially, millions of additional barrels per day could eventually enter the market. More supply means lower prices. Lower prices are disastrous for Russia. Russia's federal budget depends heavily on oil and gas revenues. Even small drops in the price per barrel translate into billions of dollars lost annually. In a wartime economy where military spending consumes an ever larger share of state resources, this vulnerability becomes existential. In other words, Maduro's fall threatened to weaken Russia's ability to finance war itself. The military hardware problem. The economic shock was compounded by a military embarrassment. Venezuela had invested heavily in Russian-made systems, S-300 air defenses, Buk M2 missile systems, Pantsir batteries, and T-72 tanks. These assets were meant to deter foreign intervention and project strength. They failed. Despite their presence, U.S. forces entered Venezuelan airspace, operated near Caracas, and extracted the country's leader without significant resistance. From a marketing perspective, this was catastrophic for Moscow. Russian weapons are not just tools of war, they are export products, a major source of revenue and influence. Their perceived effectiveness matters enormously to current and potential buyers. The Venezuelan operation sent a clear signal. Against a technologically superior adversary, Russian systems could be neutralized quickly. For countries considering Russian arms purchases, that message was unsettling. A blow to Russia's global narrative. For years, the Kremlin promoted an image of strategic resilience. Despite sanctions, despite isolation, Russia claimed it was building a parallel global order, one not dependent on the West. Venezuela was part of that story. Its sudden removal from Moscow's orbit exposed the fragility of that narrative. Allies, especially smaller states, began asking uncomfortable questions. If Russia could not protect a key partner in its own hemisphere, what guarantees could it offer elsewhere? If Russian weapons could not secure Caracas, could they secure anyone? The damage was psychological as much as material. Financial isolation tightens. There was another quieter consequence. Venezuela had served as a financial workaround. Through complex trade arrangements, barter deals, and opaque payment mechanisms, it allowed Russian entities to move value outside Western-dominated systems. With Maduro gone, those channels faced scrutiny, disruption, or outright closure. Banks hesitated. Shipping insurers reconsidered. Middlemen disappeared. Sanctions do not need to be airtight to be effective. They only need to introduce enough friction to make transactions costly and risky. The loss of Venezuela increased that friction. Moscow's strategic dilemma. From the Kremlin's perspective, options were limited. Military retaliation was unthinkable. Diplomatic protest changed nothing. Economic countermeasures lacked leverage. Russia could condemn the operation. It could rally rhetorical support. It could invoke international law, but it could not reverse the outcome. This asymmetry between outrage and impotence highlighted a deeper reality. Russia's ability to project power outside its immediate neighborhood was shrinking. The war in Ukraine, a direct connection. The timing could not have been worse for Moscow. The war in Ukraine remained costly both financially and politically. Sustaining it required steady revenue streams, access to resources, and confidence among domestic elites. Maduro's fall undermined all three. Lower oil prices meant less money. Reduced arms credibility meant fewer exports. Lost alliances meant fewer diplomatic shields. Each factor alone was manageable. Together they formed a compound pressure. The silent reaction. Inside Russia. Publicly, Russian officials dismissed the event as illegal and provocative. Privately, the reaction was far more anxious. Economic planners recalculated forecasts. Defense officials assessed reputational damage. Political strategists debated whether the United States had crossed a line or simply demonstrated a line Russia could not cross itself. The message was hard to ignore. Power gaps were widening, not narrowing. A new kind of vulnerability. For decades, Russia relied on energy dominance as its ultimate buffer. As long as oil and gas flowed, the state could absorb shocks. But the global energy landscape was changing. Diversification, alternative suppliers, and political intervention reduced Russia's leverage. Venezuela had been a way to compensate, to add volume, influence, and unpredictability. That option was gone. More than a political loss. The capture of Nicolás Maduro was often described as a political humiliation for Moscow. That description misses the point. It was an economic wound, a strategic reversal, and a warning. Not all battles are fought with tanks. Some are fought through contracts that never get signed, oil that never gets pumped, and money that never reaches a treasury. In that sense, the most damaging effects of the operation were invisible. But they were real. The larger pattern. Maduro's fall fit into a broader pattern confronting Russia. Diminishing room to maneuver, shrinking alliances, and increasing exposure to global market forces it cannot control. It did not end Russia's ambitions, but it made them more expensive, more fragile, and more risky. And in a prolonged confrontation with the West, that may matter more than any single battlefield outcome. Closing transition. As the dust settled in Caracas, attention shifted elsewhere, to Moscow, to Kyiv, and to Washington. Because the real question was no longer whether the operation had succeeded. It was what precedent it had set. If leaders could be extracted, alliances dismantled, and economies reshaped without formal war, then the rules of global power were changing. And everyone was watching.